Welcome back to the Patronus Pages. Today we will be doing another reading from The Many Deaths of Harry Potter. Chapter 49. Wrongness. The counter-attack that everyone had feared happening didn't happen for another 2 weeks. Harry woke to find everyone already talking about the attacks that had been made on several ministry outposts over the night. The Daily Prophet showed pictures of buildings burning, of bodies on the ground on Diagon Alley. The number of dead was unknown, but the important thing was that in the midst of it, Azkaban was attacked and the prisoners released. The most deadly of the former Death Eaters were out, and the third task was suddenly on no one's minds at all. Over the next 2 days, the rolls of the dead trickled in. Only 20 ministry employees had been killed, most of them Aurors working in Azkaban. Most of the dead in the pictures were passers-by or people who were in ministry offices with business there. Another 60 had been killed there. In the space of an evening, all the goodwill that Scrimgeour had gathered had vanished. No one felt like celebrating, and everyone was suddenly gloomy. Harry strangely felt almost at home in this new world. Suddenly, everyone was thinking like he was, and the things he'd been saying for years were finally coming true. His confusion over his strange physical feelings for Fleur cleared up. He'd been a fool to even contemplate feelings like that. Instead, he had to redouble his focus on what was important. Voldemort was coming, and if he'd allowed himself to forget that he'd been a fool, if he sometimes found himself looking in Fleur's direction, it wasn't a sign of regret. It was simply the acknowledgement of a fellow champion. After all, he wasn't a normal teenage boy. He didn't have the luxury of falling in love or of having a girlfriend. That part of his life would have to wait until everything was over. As he began to ignore Fleur, Hermione began to become more friendly toward him again. A little of their former easiness together began to creep back into their interactions, although it still wasn't what it had been. Over the 2 weeks following, there were no follow-up attacks. It was thought that Voldemort was consolidating his ranks, gathering his new soldiers, and readying them for battle. The general consensus was that a massive attack was coming. The only question was when. There was even talk of delaying or cancelling the third task. However, the champions were all magically bound, and it was decided that the third task had to go forward. The consequences of breaking the contract were too grave for them not to go forward. The sounds from the crowd were different now than they had been during the second task. The excited chattering and murmuring was gone. During the second task, there had been a feeling of anticipation that was entirely absent now. The stands were beginning to fill, and there was only a low, anxious murmuring. People were worried, and Harry suspected that everyone was hoping the task would be over with as soon as possible, so that they could return to the safety of their homes. All this despite the fact that there were twice as many Aurors patrolling as there had been during the last task. There were enough that Harry had to wonder where they'd found them all. He worried a little that they'd pulled too many from other tasks, leaving the ministry undefended. The stands were half empty, even as the task was about to begin. Many people had decided to stay home rather than risk an attack that many people were beginning to assume was coming. Ludo Bagman stared at the crowd, then sighed out loud. Harry suspected that he wanted to wait, hoping that more people were going to arrive, but no one wanted that. The sooner this was over and done with, the sooner everyone could go home. At least the stands had been magically elevated so that the crowds could see what was happening in the maze. A one-way wall of mist had been erected so that the audience couldn't give the champions suggestions or advice, and the sounds of the crowd were magically muffled as Harry stepped out onto what had once been the Quidditch pitch. Now it was covered in 20-foot hedges with no way to see what was inside. Considering that Hagrid was supplying the monsters, Harry suspected that he'd have an edge in dealing with them. However, he didn't actually want to win. Harry would have simply sat by the entrance in his invisibility cloak, waiting for Crumb to find the trophy if the entire school wasn't watching. He'd gotten enough anger from his fellow students over his last stunt that he decided that he needed to at least look like he was trying. He had to find a way to throw the contest while looking as though he was doing his very best. Trying to anticipate how his winning the contest would benefit Voldemort had been maddening. Harry's best guess was that the winning cup was booby-trapped to kill him the moment he touched it. He wasn't sure if it would kill the first person to touch it, or only Harry. In any case, Harry had no intention of actually touching the thing. He'd leave that to Crumb. Or maybe he'd simply accidentally destroy the cup and no one would win. It would infuriate Scrimgeour, but a tie was almost as historic as an actual win, and there wasn't as much of a chance that Crumb's body would end up making Hermione cry. McGonagall was standing next to Bagman. "We will be watching from places where we can reach you. If you wish to be rescued, simply send up red sparks." At least they were learning from past mistakes. No longer would the people who were needed to rescue the hapless be trapped behind magical shields, unable to reach the very people they had to help. Harry nodded. "Is everyone ready?" Bagman asked. Harry looked at the others, who reluctantly nodded. He smiled at Fleur, who looked away. Bagman pointed his wand at his throat and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the third and final task of the Tri-Wizard tournament is about to begin. Harry Potter will go first, as he is in first place. Victor Crumb will follow behind, and Fleur Delacour will be allowed to enter the maze last. On your mark, Harry. Get ready. Get set. Go!" Harry stepped into the shadowy expanse of the maze. He didn't run, first because he suspected that there would be traps and monsters waiting, and second because reaching the centre too quickly would make it clear he was trying not to win. Everyone would understand his being paranoid. It was part of his public persona. If he lost because he was too cautious, people would just attribute that to his personality. Harry moved forward 50 yards. The interior of the maze had been magically expanded. Normally this would have been a third of the entire size of the pitch, but he could tell he hadn't gone nearly that far. Everyone was probably expecting some creative way of winding this, cutting his way to the centre, maybe using some spell, or finding a way to leap over the maze or simply walk across the top of it. Harry had considered these things and decided against them. For one thing, the Weasley wall walking boots didn't work on hedge walls. For another, he was trying not to win. The sound of the whistle letting Crumb into the maze told him that the time advantage for being first in the first two tasks wasn't particularly long. What was the point then? "Point me," he whispered, holding his wand in his hand. It spun like a compass, pointing toward the centre of the maze. He had to go northwest. As he turned a corner, he stumbled. Hagrid's blast-ended scroots were now 10 foot long, and their upper hides were spell-resistant. He'd suspected that they would be used for the tournament. Why else would the school tolerate his growing them? Their undersides were vulnerable. "Bombarda!" he yelled, pointing his wand at the earth underneath the scroot. The blast was strong enough to flip the scroot over, but not enough to kill it. Harry rushed closer to it and cast a full body bind on its unprotected underside before rushing by it. The spell wouldn't last long, not against a monster that size, which would mean that the monster would serve as an impediment to whoever came after. While he didn't mean for it to work, it had to look like something he would do to those watching. Right, left, right again. The disadvantage to a maze was that it might take forever to find the right route. He was already tired of the endless foliage, the never-ending green. He stopped as he saw a nasty pinkish mist ahead of him. Glancing around, Harry saw a rock, which he transfigured into a hedgehog. The hedgehog wasn't a very good one. It still largely looked like a rock. However, it walked and it had skin, which was good enough. Sending it into the mist, Harry heard it scream as massive blisters rose on its skin. He returned it to stone before it had time to be in too much pain. He grimaced. Was this a legitimate part of the trial, or was it a trap by Voldemort? He turned and blasted a hole in the foliage beside him. Moving through the wall, he saw that the pink mist hadn't followed and didn't extend through the wall. However, as he moved through the hole, the foliage regrew behind him, leaving the wall unblemished. Harry checked with the Point Me spell and then altered his course. Without that spell, he'd have been lost here forever, at least until he decided to blow his way out. He really needed to convince Sirius to teach him apparition, not that it would work on Hogwarts grounds. 10 minutes passed, and Harry heard Fleur scream. He froze, but a moment later saw red sparks flying up. Auras on brooms were already in the air, and a moment later he saw Fleur being flown away, massive blisters covering her body. Apparently she'd encountered some of that red mist. Harry wasn't sure of what method would help against it. The bubble-headed charm only covered the head. He hoped she wasn't in too much pain, but that meant that the victory was going to have to be given to Crumb, which irritated him. Why, he wasn't sure. He'd thought Crumb seemed decent enough earlier in the year, but now he found him grating. As he turned yet another corner, he felt the world spin. Suddenly the sky was below him and the earth was above him. Fortunately, he'd had experience with the twins' wall-walking shoes. He moved confidently down the pathway, even though he was running on top of the bushes. The world spun again and he fell, bruising his palm. He grabbed his wand, thankful that it hadn't been damaged, and he continued on. He realized that he was getting close when even through the shielding he heard the sounds of the crowd. He wondered if he needed to start slowing, giving Crumb a chance to get ahead of him. Turning a corner, he saw a Sphinx. She began to speak, but Harry was already moving forward. "Stupefy! Stupefy! Impedimenta!" He was already moving past the Sphinx before it occurred to him to wonder what it had been trying to say. Probably some kind of riddle. Sphinxes were mad for riddles. A moment later, he stumbled into the clearing with the cup. Harry stumbled to a stop. Crumb wasn't here yet, and there was no reason not to take the cup from the sound of the screaming crowd. "Potter!" Turning, Harry saw Crumb coming from behind him. He had apparently bypassed the stunned Sphinx without any problem. Crumb said, "What are you to Hermione? She talks of you all the time." "This is hardly the place for that," Harry said. He gestured upward at where the crowd presumably was. "We've got a game to win." An ugly expression crossed Crumb's face, and he lifted his wand. Harry immediately snapped out with a shielding spell. He waved his wand, but cast non-verbally. It took Harry a moment to realize what it was. Accio, damn! As the Triwizard Cup slammed into the back of Harry's head, he felt the distinctive feeling of a portkey activating. Harry woke, and it took him an uncomfortably long time for him to figure out where he was or what was going on. His thinking felt foggy, and the back of his head hurt. His head ached, and his vision was blurry. He was seeing two of everything. Trying to move his arms, Harry realized that ropes were tied around them. He was tied against something. A quick look around showed that he was in a graveyard, so it was probably a gravestone. For some reason his arm hurt. Looking over, he could see a splotch of red blood staining his arm. A man stood in front of him. His face was lined and wrinkled, but Harry had the sense that he was younger than his face would seem to present. His tongue slipped in and out of his mouth, and Harry wondered if he was an animagi with a frog form. He seemed occupied with a large cauldron in front of Harry. "Have to get this right," he was muttering. "Important to get the master as perfect as possible." The man seemed completely focused on the task in front of him, something that Harry hoped to use to his advantage. He focused on a spot near the man and began to wandlessly and wordlessly transfigure the dirt. For a moment he thought that nothing was happening, but then he saw a little smoke rising from the dirt. He'd managed to change a few grains of dirt into a silvery liquid. The smoke fizzled after a moment, and Harry focused on creating more and more of the liquid metal. "What's going on?" Harry asked. He slurred his words more than he had to, because looking weak, this case would only help keep him alive. As he did so, he continued to change the dirt a little at a time. It was difficult work. He was sweating heavily. Fortunately, the transmuted particles was concealed by the smoke from the fire under the cauldron. The man didn't look at him. Instead, he just whistled a jaunty little tune as he prepared ingredients. "Bartemius," a whispered voice came from nearby. "My most faithful servant, is it ready?" There was something on the ground. It looked like a pile of rags, but something was moving inside of it. Harry grimaced, dreading seeing what was within. Finally, seeming to pay attention, the man turned and smiled. "Tonight you will be restored, Master, and your reign will begin." Harry continued to transfigure piece after piece of dirt, even as the man turned and bent down. A snake, larger than any that Harry had ever seen, slithered through the grass toward them. He'd seen that snake before somewhere. It took him a moment to realize that he'd seen it in a dream. The man turned and bent down, and from the rags he pulled a monstrosity. It was the size of a baby, but it wasn't like any baby Harry had ever seen. Instead, it was hairless and slimy, a dark reddish black. It looked a little like a human baby that had been badly transfigured, turned partially into a snake and partially into something else. It was moving feebly, and it was whispering something Harry couldn't hear. "It will be so, Master," the man said. Gently, he placed the thing into the water. Harry hoped that it would drown, but he doubted that it would be so simple. Raising his wand, he intoned, "Bone of the Father, unknowingly given, you will renew your son." The surface of the grave to which Harry was bound cracked and split. Harry was horrified as dust emerged and flew into the cauldron. For a moment, he was worried that the cracking of the grave would disturb the growing pile of material he was making. Fortunately, the dust settled without any problem. "Flesh of the servant willingly given," the man said. He had an almost maniacal look in his eyes, but even so he hesitated a moment. "You will revive your master." A moment later, Harry gasped as the man cut off his own hand and dropped it into the water. The man staggered and almost fell into the fire, but he managed to grab his wand and use it to seal the wound. The man's face was slowly bleaching white as he screamed in agony. He screamed for what seemed like forever, although it could have been only a couple of minutes. Harry waited for him to come over to him. He knew exactly what he was going to do. It would stop him and prevent Voldemort's resurrection all at once. Instead, the man simply reached behind the cauldron and pulled out a blood-stained dagger. Harry realized that this was why his arm was bleeding. Apparently the man hadn't trusted his own ability to cut Harry after cutting his own hand off. "Blood of the enemy, forcibly taken, you will resurrect your enemy." The man was having to force the words out, as though he was on the verge of unconsciousness. Harry had a momentary hope that he would pass out and fall into the cauldron before the spell was actually complete, but his luck wasn't that good. Sparks and steam rose from the cauldron. Terrified, Harry redoubled his efforts at transfiguration, piece after piece. He'd never dared to transfigure this much, not within the castle, but this was Voldemort. Too much was better than not enough. A tall, skeletally white figure rose from the cauldron. "Robe me," he commanded the man beside him, who looked as though he was about to fall over. The man did his best, but he fumbled as he did so. Voldemort stood and he examined his own body. He pulled his wand from his pocket and he gestured with it. Something like molten silver emerged from it, shaping itself into something like a human hand. The man Bartemius screamed as it moulded itself to his arm. "You will be first among all my servants for your loyal service," he said. He turned to Harry, who was still silently creating more and more of the substance. He walked forward, not noticing as he stepped right through the puddle of liquid metal Harry had just created. He didn't seem to notice, even though his feet were bare. "Your body will be the proof my followers need," Voldemort said. "Proof that I am death incarnate." Harry scowled. "How did you even get me here?" He continued to cast, making the pile of metal larger and larger. He had to keep Voldemort talking if he was to have a chance. Voldemort smirked. "Bartemius Imperius Bagman, and Bagman Imperius the other two champions." "How do you know I'd even be selected? If you are to be my opponent, how could you not?" Harry continued to make the puddle behind Voldemort grow. It had almost reached the fire, which Harry didn't want. That would be a disaster. Harry scowled. "You think you've won?" Channeling his inner Gryffindor, he hoped Voldemort would continue not to notice what was right behind him. "I have," Voldemort said, reaching up and grabbing his face. "I am now flesh of your flesh, and your mother's protection no longer burns me." He reached for his wand. It's time to end this. Harry realized this was his only chance. Accio Cauldron. The cauldron was made of heavy stone and filled with water. Harry focused on only pulling the top of the cauldron toward him. It tipped and tottered before it spilled. Voldemort, to his credit, had time to turn and see the water spill across the puddle Harry had created. It was a metal alloy of sodium and potassium, two elements that exploded in water, and Harry had just spent the last 5 minutes creating a massive amount of it. How massive became clear a moment later as everything exploded and his entire world was fire. As Harry died, he felt a sudden sensation of wrongness, a twisting that had never been there before. He'd never been aware of the process of dying, he'd always simply awoken, but now he felt himself being pulled back. It was almost as though something was holding him back, as though he was being twisted between two timelines. A moment later he woke up screaming. Chapter 50. Looted. Bodies lay on the ground below him, blood pooling them. It took Harry a long moment to realize where he was and what had happened. His voice was raw, and he felt as though he'd been screaming and would never stop. He felt a touch on his shoulder, and he whipped around, wand still in his hand, only to face Sirius. "We need to get out of here," Sirius said, "before the auras come." Harry stared at him. Somehow he'd lost an entire school year, and it didn't fit the pattern. He should have woken up after defeating the dragon, or maybe after defeating the merpeople, although he suspected they hadn't really been dangerous enough to create a reset point. Instead, he'd lost more time than he ever had before, and he had a sense of impending doom. Harry nodded finally, and he followed Sirius quickly through the woods. The nausea and confusion from the concussion were gone at least. His mind was clear, whereas before it had been all he could do to cast the spells that he'd been working on all term. His original plan had been to create the flammable alloy, then blast Voldemort or whoever came for him with water from his wand. That would have set off the reaction from a distance. Unfortunately, as concussed as he had been, he'd been unable to realize that the alloy was too close and he'd created too much of it. Fire hurt in a way the Crucio hadn't. Harry moved swiftly behind Sirius, noting that a year had made a great deal of difference in how he moved. The Sirius he had gotten used to was assured and healthy. This man still had some skittishness to him. It made Harry wonder, if he'd snapped back all the way to first year, would he even recognize Hermione or Neville? They were completely different people now than they had been when it all began. They'd seem younger than Colin Creevy's younger brother. Harry couldn't help but worry about what had changed. Something was different, and that wasn't something he could be comfortable with. It was possible that the spell that had created his resets had broken, in which case he was now living his final life. There was no way to know whether that was true until he died and didn't come back. On the good side, Voldemort would have lost his body. All Harry would have to do was find out where Tom Riddle's father was buried, and he'd be able to eliminate a vital component to the spell. He decided that the one person he could trust to help him with that was moving through the forest right in front of him. "There's nothing left," Sirius said, staring at the gravestone. The gravestone was cracked, and whatever had been inside was gone. This was entirely wrong. The last time they'd waited almost an entire year before breaking into the tomb for the bones of Tom Riddle's father. Things only changed when Harry changed them. That was the one thing he'd been certain of for the last years of his life. People did what they did, and nothing changed until Harry exerted his influence on it. Harry glanced at Sirius. He'd convinced Sirius that he'd learned of a spell by which Voldemort could be resurrected using the bones of his nearest living relative. It had taken Sirius 2 days to find the gravesite and another to bring Harry here by night. "This isn't right," Harry said. "They shouldn't be moving so fast." "Does the spell have to be cast by the full moon or something?" Sirius asked. He was staring at the grave. He'd been performing spells that Harry didn't know, confirming that the grave was completely empty. Harry shook his head. "I don't know. This just doesn't seem right somehow." "I'm going to have to tell Dumbledore about this," Sirius said. He looked at Harry. "He'd probably going to have a few questions for you." Harry nodded grimly. He didn't know what he was going to say, but whatever it was couldn't be worse than whatever had just happened. The sound of a footstep behind him was Harry's only warning. He turned, grabbing for his wand, but it was already too late. A dozen figures in black robes were moving out of the mist, and their wands were pointed at Harry. "Grab onto me," Sirius said, his eyes never leaving the men. His hand was on his wand. Harry grabbed Sirius's arm, but nothing happened. "Anti-apparition jinx," Sirius said. He grimaced. "On the count of 3, dive behind the gravestone. I'll distract them." 1, he said under his breath, but it was already too late. Before either of them could move, green light lashed out, hitting him both. The strange twisting sensation happened again, although this time not as intensely. Harry was aware of being pulled backward. The bodies of Death Eaters lay before him. Harry stared down at them and shuddered. Voldemort had known he was coming, and he'd prepared for it. That shouldn't have happened unless Sirius's questions had alerted Voldemort's people. Someone that Sirius had talked to had to work for Voldemort. That was the simplest explanation. Harry had convinced Sirius to go digging for information, and that had led to Voldemort learning what he was looking for. It fit everything he knew about the resets much better than some strange theory that things had changed. Harry felt a sudden surge of relief. He understood this, and he could work with it. That meant that Harry had to go to Little Hangleton on his own this time, before Voldemort had a chance to be alerted and move his father's bones. He'd have to ditch Sirius. There wasn't any time to explain to him what was happening. Even though Sirius was more open-minded than any of the other adult wizards Harry had known, he'd still had questions. "We need to go," Sirius said. "The auras are coming." Harry nodded, and they began to move through the forest again. If he managed to get the bone before Voldemort, he'd be able to stop the entire plot before it started. Voldemort might not even know it was impossible for months until he had someone check on the gravesite. He'd be careful, though. If he was wrong and something else was happening, it was entirely possible that Voldemort would still have people waiting. As they reached the part of the forest outside the anti-apparition wards, Harry decided again that he really needed to learn to apparate on his own. Sirius grabbed him, and a moment later Harry felt like he was being pulled through a toothpaste tube. They ended up on the front step of his house, and they slipped inside. "Are you all right, Harry?" Sirius asked. "I know it's never an easy thing to kill a man, much less several." Harry was confused for a moment, then realized that Sirius was talking about his killing the Death Eaters. "They were coming for us," Harry said. "There wasn't any choice." He'd had this conversation with Sirius the first time, and it had lasted longer than he liked then. Now he felt a certain sense of urgency. Getting to the bones either wasn't time-sensitive, or it was, and for the moment he wasn't certain which. "You were right to do it," Sirius said. He shook his head. "I don't think I could have done something like that at your age." Harry sighed. If he let this conversation go on, it could last for a couple of hours, time he might not be able to afford to lose. "It might be better if I go home," Harry said, "and make sure that my aunt and uncle stay inside. There may be other attacks, and I'd hate for them to be hurt while I'm off enjoying myself." Sirius stared at him for a moment before saying, "All right, but we will have this talk later." The fact that Harry literally knew how it was going to go wasn't encouraging. Still, it was a little heartwarming to know that Sirius, of all people, actually cared enough about him to lecture him. Sirius stood. "I can go myself," Harry said. "I think I just proved that." Sirius was apparently alert enough to know that Harry wasn't being honest with him. He stared at him for a long moment. "I'd feel better if I went with you," Sirius said. Harry considered his options for a long moment. He could simply allow Sirius to escort him across from Arabella Figg's house and end up having to try to sneak back across to get into her flu terminal. However, she'd lock her door, and because of the trace, he'd be unable to get back inside. He could try to summon the night bus, but that would leave a record of where he lived, unless he left himself vulnerable by finding other ways to get across town, none of which would be easy at this hour of night. "We need to make a side trip," Harry said. Sirius watched him without speaking. "There's a ritual that can resurrect Voldemort," Harry said. "Part of it involves the bones from his father, which are in a graveyard in Little Hangleton." "How do you know this?" Sirius asked. Harry hesitated. Whatever he said now could have serious consequences for his future. Was there a lie that he could make Sirius believe? Finally he said, "I sometimes have glimpses into the future. It's not always reliable, but when it is, I know I have to follow through." Most seers don't remember what they see, Sirius said, and true prophecies are impossible to see. What I see can be changed, Harry said stubbornly. Sometimes. Sirius was quiet for a long moment. You haven't told any of this to Dumbledore. He works for the Ministry. I've heard about what the unspeakables do to people who have unique abilities. Dumbledore wouldn't turn you in, Sirius said, looking shocked. He's pinned his hopes on you and the hopes of an entire generation. Still, Harry said, we need to go. Sirius nodded. If you want to go grave robbing, let's go. It'll be like old times with your dad. Harry moved to the fireplace and grabbed a pinch of flue powder. I don't suppose you have a broom. If you don't, it's going to be a long walk. Sirius shook his head. I mostly apparate. You should teach me sometime, Harry said. I don't care what the Ministry says, it's something I need to know. Sirius didn't hesitate. I'd be happy to. I'd be happier knowing you could get away if more than 6 Death Eaters come after you. Harry threw the flue powder into the fire. Let's go, he said. By the time they arrived, the grave had already been looted. The Triwizard Tournament, Dumbledore said. Harry scowled. He'd been in a foul mood for days, ever since coming across Tom Riddle's father's recently opened grave. They'd only missed it by minutes. The dust was still settling from where the grave had been cracked open. Sirius had insisted that he had to tell Dumbledore, and Harry knew there would be questions. It was only a matter of time before he had a discussion with the headmaster that he really didn't want to have. The excitement of the children around him wasn't something Harry could share. He couldn't help but feel that he was being railroaded, forced to do something he didn't want to do. The fact that he was going to have to repeat another year wasn't helping any either. He'd enjoyed the previous year, at least the parts that didn't involve terror and the risk of death. Going through the same classes was becoming less and less tolerable. He was growing tired of it all, and part of him couldn't help but wish it was all over. The weirdest thing had been seeing Hermione on the train. The hesitance that had dogged his relationship with her over the past few months was completely gone. To this, Hermione, the Yule Ball had never happened. It was the only good thing about this reset. He'd had most of a year of training with Moody, but the man looked at him as though he'd never seen him before. Harry hadn't ever really been able to get the man's trust, but he'd felt that they were kindred spirits. The only question was how much Voldemort knew. Had he really come back with Harry, or was he simply having visions from Harry's life? The second case would be bad enough, while the first would be a disaster. Voldemort had all the advantages, power, troops, and the advantage that every attacker had, in that he knew when he was planning to attack, while the defender had to try not to be surprised. If only Harry had been given a little more time. He was good enough to kill several Death Eaters if he had the advantage of surprise or of one of his tricks, but he doubted that he'd be able to stand up against any of the more powerful members of Voldemort's circle. As Dumbledore ended his speech, a Slytherin prefect came to Harry as everyone was rising to their feet, ready to head back to their quarters. The first years were being gathered together as a group by the Slytherin head boy. "The headmaster wishes to speak with you," he said quietly. "The password to his office is chocolate cockroach." Harry nodded grimly. Every step toward the headmaster's office felt heavier than the last. Harry hated the fact that he was having to deal with this, but there wasn't any choice. He'd considered obliviating Sirius, but the man had been watching him too closely, and it would be a gross violation of the trust that was beginning to grow between them. "Chocolate cockroach," Harry said to the gargoyle guarding the headmaster's office. He slipped through the passageway, and a moment later he found himself facing Dumbledore. "Headmaster," Harry said. "Harry," Dumbledore said, "take a seat." Harry sat reluctantly and shook his head when the headmaster offered him a piece of candy. He suspected that if it wasn't for wizarding medicine, the man would have lost his teeth long before, even if he wasn't over 100 years old. "Sirius has given me some disturbing news," Dumbledore said, "as well as an intriguing claim about an ability of yours that you haven't chosen to share." Harry stared at the table in front of him. "It's not a claim." He'd read enough about legilimency to know better than to look the man in the eye. He suspected that both Dumbledore and Snape could read minds. He'd asked Moody about it, and the man had been conspicuously taciturn about it. It seems a little fantastic. It's unlike the usual abilities we see in seers. "Why don't you test me?" Harry asked. If it wasn't for the fact that there had been an opened grave, he'd have claimed he was lying about his ability. Now he needed to convince a man with 10 times the life experience he had that he was telling the truth. The only way to do that was to include as much truth as possible into the lie. "What can you tell me about the future?" Dumbledore asked. "I can tell you that the 3 tasks for the Tri-Wizard tournament will involve dragons, mermen, and a maze," Harry said. "There will be a Yule Ball." "Exceptional," Dumbledore said, leaning forward. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" "You're planning a major offensive against the Death Eaters," Harry said. "Planning to attack maybe 40 of them. It will happen somewhere around the time of the second task. And how will this work out?" "Well," Harry said, "but there will be retaliation." "I would imagine so," Dumbledore said. "The Dementors will defect afterwards, and Azkaban will be emptied while the Death Eaters use attacks on the Ministry as a distraction." Dumbledore suddenly became very still. "Are you sure about this? But the thing is, the visions I have of the future aren't set in stone. They can be changed." It was important for Harry to emphasize that. True prophecies couldn't be changed, and Harry had noticed a sort of resigned acceptance about them from wizards who had studied them. The last thing he wanted Dumbledore to believe was that it was hopeless. "You've done this?" Harry nodded. "A few times, although there were some things I wasn't able to change." Colin and Adrian flashed across his mind's eye, along with a flash of regret. It was easier now with the passage of time to accept that they were gone, but part of him couldn't help but hope for another anomalous reset, one that would take him back farther than the others. "And you've had dreams from Voldemort's perspective." Now it was Harry's turn to stop moving. He hadn't told Sirius about the dreams he had occasionally. He hadn't told anyone unless he spoke in his sleep, and Malfoy or one of the others had been listening. "How did you know?" Harry asked. "There is a link between you and Voldemort," Dumbledore said, "one that leaves you both vulnerable to seeing inside the minds of the other." The sudden horror on Harry's face must have communicated itself to Dumbledore, because he rushed to explain that, "I am not certain that he knows about this. If he does, he learned about it only recently." Harry nodded. It would explain the sudden changes in Voldemort's activities, and it was a much more palatable explanation than what he feared deep in his soul was more likely to be true. "Why is this connection there?" he asked. Dumbledore hesitated. "I would prefer not to answer that question until you have mastered Occlumency. Professor Snape is an expert in the field." "Professor Moody is even better, I suspect," Harry said. "And if Professor Snape is actually your spy, teaching me Occlumency wouldn't endear him to Voldemort." Dumbledore nodded. "Tell me about this ritual you foresaw him using. Perhaps we can find another way to forestall his ascension." For a moment, Harry almost felt optimistic. Although there were unsettling developments with Voldemort, at least now he had Dumbledore and his people more on his side than they had been before. If they believed he was actually a seer, they'd listen to him, and that would give him the power to steer things in a way that a boy his apparent age normally would never have. Chapter 51. Occlumency. Nothing changed in the days that followed. Harry had somehow thought that things might. After all, Voldemort's actions had changed. What else might change? The third option that he hadn't considered was that something was changing everyone, and that the world itself had been set off its predetermined path. It was only a thought. Nothing he saw suggested that it might actually be true. Maybe he hoped it might be true because the only alternatives were that Voldemort was digging around in his head, or that Voldemort had been pulled back with him. Learning Occlumency was a priority now, even if it risked Moody learning his secret. Harry suspected that he could obliviate Moody if he had to. He'd had a year to learn the man's moves, and he wasn't the powerhouse he'd once been. Age and infirmity had slowed him down. Even if his full secret got out, Harry wasn't sure it would be an entirely bad thing. After all, they already thought he was a seer and hadn't reported him to the unspeakables. It might be that knowing the full truth would make them even more useful to him than they were already proving to be. Still, part of him had a certain reluctance to reveal the secret. He'd held on to it for a good portion of his life, and it had been an ingrained habit to hold on to it. A word from Dumbledore had him sitting in a classroom waiting for Moody. Harry heard the distinctive sound of Moody's artificial leg thumping against the floor. He readied his wand. The man had attacked him several times during their training in the last year in an effort to teach him to always be prepared. He'd been surprised that Harry had never been caught off guard. "Dumbledore thinks you're ready for me to dig around in your head," Moody said. "Seems to think you have a natural talent for it." That was a surprise to Harry. Dumbledore had never said anything to him about it to him. He wondered if that meant Dumbledore had tried to look inside his head and failed, or if it was a general assessment about his personality. Harry shrugged. "I'm a Slytherin. He probably thinks we're all good at hiding things." Moody chortled. "He'd be right too. The lot of you do enough scheming that you pretty much always have something to hide." Harry grimaced. He had more to hide than most people. He hoped he was as good at this as Dumbledore thought he might be. "So how do we do this?" "You've read the book I gave you last week?" Moody asked. Although it had been on top of his other assignments, it wasn't like Harry actually had to study any of those. He'd been through them before, and in actuality, the only grades that mattered for graduation were his owls. That assumed he actually survived to graduate. "Read it 3 times, Harry said. "I'm still not sure I understand it." "Good. Give it back." Moody held his hand out. "That book really isn't supposed to leave Aura custody. You didn't let anyone else see you reading it." "I charmed the outside to look like another book," Harry said. "I was careful. You can depend on that." He reached into his bag and handed the book to Moody, who examined it for a moment before slipping it into his own bag. Pulling a flask from his pocket, he took a swig from it. Harry caught a whiff of something alcoholic from the flask, and it didn't smell like fire whiskey. He'd asked Moody once why he drank, and Moody told him that even with all the magic wizards had to offer, he was still in constant chronic pain. There were muggle drugs that might have helped him, but they tended to cloud the mind, which would leave him vulnerable to attack. Alcohol dulled reaction times as well, but he'd developed a tolerance for it. It didn't really dull the pain, but it made him pay less attention to it. The book said that Legilimency wasn't really about reading minds, but I didn't really understand how it isn't. If you can see someone's thoughts, isn't that reading their mind? "If you'd ever looked into someone else's mind, you wouldn't think so," Moody said. "People don't think like you'd think they would. They don't even think like you think. Some people have well-organized minds, and other people have minds that are all jumbled up. Are the organized people better at occlumency?" Moody frowned. "Not always. Organized minds are much easier to sort through. I've dealt with criminals whose minds jumped from thought to thought so quickly that there was no way to get a grasp on what they were thinking in the moment, much less what kinds of memories they had." Harry wondered if his mind would be considered ordered or jumbled. With nothing to compare it to, he had no way of judging. In any case, people don't simply think in words. They have flashes of memory, sudden feelings and images. "Will you teach me Legilimency too?" Harry asked. Moody chortled, as though the idea of teaching Harry Legilimency was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. While it was true that most boys Harry's age couldn't have learned something like that without taking horrible advantage of it, Harry wasn't actually the age everyone thought he was. "I need every advantage I can get," Harry said defensively. "Voldemort has an army." Moody was silent for a moment. "I'll talk to Dumbledore about it. I think he should have some say in whether some of his students can go around staring into girls' heads." "I'm not interested in what's in girls' heads," Harry said, slightly offended, "unless they're potential Death Eaters." "Not interested in girls yet, Potter?" Harry shrugged. Well, the Bo Baxton's champion is going to be quite the looker, but I'm pretty sure I won't have anything that she wants. He was fairly sure that the only reason she'd given him the time of day the first time around had been his performance in the first task, his status as a champion, and his fame as the boy who lived. If he'd missed out on any one of those, she wouldn't have given him a single thought. This time he wouldn't ask either Hermione or Fleur to the dance. It had been too damaging to his relationship to his oldest and best friend, and it had been too confusing with Fleur. That could be an educated guess, Moody said. He still wasn't on board with Harry's claims of being a seer. She's part Veela, Harry said. At Moody's expression, he said, "Just wait." Well, I suppose I'll be seeing whatever you think you saw soon enough, Moody said. How often are you wanting to go through this? I promise you it won't be pretty. I think you'll find that I'm used to it, Harry said. We need to get this as fast as possible. If you've got time every day, I'll be happy to try it. At Moody's expression, Harry said, "If I think it's too much, I'll tell you. Or I guess you'll know, won't you?" "There are slower ways to learn it," Moody said, "ways that involve a lot of time and a little pain. Dumbledore doesn't think we have that much time. So I'll have to teach you in a way that involves a little time and a lot of time. Most boys your age wouldn't be able to take that kind of pain." Harry smiled grimly. "You'd be surprised what I can tolerate. What do I need to do?" "I'll try to break into your mind. You'll try to defend yourself. When we're done, I'll give you some suggestions about what you did wrong, and we'll do it again." Although Moody didn't know it, Harry had been through Moody's training before, and he had a pretty good idea of what Moody didn't consider torture. That meant that this was going to be pretty bad. "The book says I'm supposed to clear my mind of all thoughts and emotions," Harry said. Moody nodded. "That's the basic version. If you manage to master that, we'll try more advanced variations, where you can lie by only showing legilimens what they want to see," Harry said. He was excited about learning to do that. He was excited about a lot of what this training could potentially do for him. If he mastered it well enough, he would be much more resistant to the Imperious Curse than he already was. He might be able to resist Veritaserum, which was one reason it wasn't always admissible in wizarding court. It would even help him resist being possessed. One of Harry's nightmares after first year was that he would kill Voldemort only to find him sticking out of the back of his own head. "Let's get started," Harry said. "At first, I'll let you know when I'm trying to get into your mind," Moody said. "But later, once you get good enough, I'll start attacking you in secret until you learn how to close your mind off without thinking." Harry nodded. "You might want to sit down," Moody said. "This could be painful." Harry sat down carefully and put his hand on his wand. Even though he knew Moody, the man had attacked him before in the interest of proving the need for constant vigilance, and he wouldn't put it past him to mix his legilimens attacks with physical ones. "Is that a threat, boy?" Harry was shaking his head when he felt a piercing pain in his head. He groaned and tried to clear his mind, but images were already flashing through his mind. He was 5, and Dudley was holding him down and hitting him. Even at that age, Dudley had been almost twice his size, and Harry remembered the pain and humiliation. The memory was vivid, much more than it usually was. Ripper the bulldog was tearing at his leg as Harry stumbled over himself trying to get away. He could hear laughter and approval from Aunt Marge, and he felt a moment of strong hatred for her. The sorting hat was on his head, and he was arguing with it about which house he belonged in. It was telling him that the door to Gryffindor had closed long before, that he was damned because of what had happened to him. Harry felt a sudden surge of interest from Moody. He'd caught a whiff of something while Harry was talking to the hat. He wanted to know what Harry was hiding, wanted to know what had happened to him, to change him from a potential Gryffindor to something less trusting and less happy. Moody was pushing in harder, and Harry felt a sudden deep sense that he didn't want Moody to know. Even if he'd thought about telling Dumbledore, it was his secret. No one should force him to reveal it against his will. He found himself on his knees, back in the classroom. Moody was slumped up against the wall, and chairs and desks were scattered everywhere. Harry rose to his feet and rushed over to the other man, who was trying to get to his feet. It was harder because he was missing a leg and looked half stunned. I suppose I'm lucky you don't really consider me an enemy, Moody said. I saw that much in your head. Harry hadn't realized that Moody had gotten that much. He wondered just how much else he had gotten. I'd be a red splatter on the wall if you did, Moody continued. Harry helped him to his feet. It's a good thing we're friends then, he said, forcing a smile. Are we, Potter? Moody said. I barely know you, but you seem to know me much better. My visions, Harry said. It had the benefit of being partially true. I saw you training me in the future, so I feel like I know you. Hopefully, that was enough of a deflection to keep him off the trail. I've got to give it to Dumbledore, he knows his Occlumens, Moody said. You've got the kind of mind that tends to be good at it. What kind of mind is that? You're good at compartmentalizing your life and your feelings, Moody said. Good at shutting down emotions, which is exactly what an Occlumens needs to do. Harry shrugged. He'd had to learn to rein in his emotions, or the constant trauma that was his life post-reset would have driven him insane. There's secrets buried deeper down that you actually protect fairly well. I'm guessing that's what Dumbledore noticed in the first place. He was probably talking about the knowledge of the resets. It was a relief that this wasn't something that Dumbledore or Snape had been able to just pluck out of his mind. I'm a Slytherin, Harry said. We're pretty good at keeping secrets. Hopefully Moody would think his secret was something innocuous, like spending time in a broom closet with another student or cheating on his tests. I think this time you should put your wand away. Not out of reach, but somewhere where it'll be a little harder to get to, Moody said, and I'll start from behind you. Harry disliked having Moody behind him, but after he'd almost put the man through a wall, he could understand why he would require that. If it was anyone else, he wouldn't have allowed it, though. It was too easy to be attacked from behind before you could react. Clear your mind, Moody said from behind him. Blank out your emotions. A moment later, he felt the sharp pain again. Suddenly, he was on his broom, fleeing the dragon, watching its open mouth gape below him as he tossed the peanut butter that was going to kill it. He was looking at the mirror of Erised and seeing Voldemort and his minions dead before him. Voldemort was rising from the cauldron, pale and horrendous in his majesty. Harry felt himself hit the floor, and the sudden pain jarred him out of whatever Moody had been doing to him. What the hell was that? Moody asked. He seemed a little shaken by what he'd seen, which was unusual for him because Harry had thought he'd seen everything. It took Harry a moment to realize what he was talking about. Visions, Harry said. Those didn't feel like visions, Moody said. They felt like memories. Unless Voldemort had already risen, it's hardly a memory, Harry said. Just something that's going to happen if we don't stop it. Moody stared at him for a long moment, and Harry suspected that he wanted to question him further, probably with Veritaserum. However, the realization that he was in the best position to find what he wanted to know much have struck Moody again. Again, Potter, Moody said. Harry struggled back to his feet and back into the chair. It took him a moment to realize that he was clutching his wand. Apparently, he'd pulled it out of his pocket without thinking while being attacked. It was a little comforting to realize that the reflexes he'd worked so long and hard to develop were worth something. As Harry looked back at Moody, he realized that this was probably going to be exactly as unpleasant as Moody had suggested it might be. Even worse, he might have to work at it for weeks or months, depending on how talented and dedicated he was at getting it. The pain started in his head again. 3 weeks of Occlumency lessons hadn't made them any less painful. Harry felt exhausted and his head ached after each session, and sometimes he wondered why he was putting himself through all of it. After all, the thought that Voldemort was looking into his head was only a theory. It wasn't proven. After all this time, Moody still hadn't broken through to his secret. According to Moody, Harry was getting stronger as an Occlumens. It was just that, as Harry got stronger, Moody set the bar a little higher and attacked with more strength. Harry had predicted that Durmstrang would arrive by ship and Bugsbaton would arrive by flying carriage. He could see Moody glancing at him as the Durmstrang students stepped out of the boat. This was exactly like the vision that he'd shown him only last week. the first confirmation that his visions were based in reality and not simply vivid imaginings of a fevered mind. Dumbledore spoke to Karkaroff, and a moment later everyone headed back inside the castle. Harry couldn't help but feel a pang as he saw Fleur. It had been more than a month since he'd seen her in his personal timeline, and even though he'd decided that it was safest for everyone if he didn't pursue her, it was still upsetting. Moody looked surprised to see Fleur. He'd seen the kiss between them in Harry's memories. Harry found himself going through the motions of the feast, barely speaking to Crumb or anyone else. He was about to be selected again to go through the farce of a tournament, and there wasn't anything he could do about it. "It is time," Dumbledore said, "for the goblet to choose the champions for the contest of champions." He'd been informed of what Harry had seen in the future, of Harry being forced to compete, and of what might happen afterward. His plan was that he would be waiting beside the cup, and whenever Harry touched it, Dumbledore would touch it at the same time. Bringing Dumbledore to wherever Voldemort was holding the ritual now would make everything almost too easy, especially with Voldemort as a baby and not at full power. This might be all over in an instant. For once, Harry was entirely behind this plan. It was simple, and he could imagine the horror on the Death Eaters' faces as Dumbledore chewed through them. Victor Crumb. It took Harry a moment to realize that Fleur Delacour had already been chosen and was exiting the room through the appointed door. He closed his eyes, ready for his name to be called out and ready for the gasps of the crowd. This was the step that would start the plan to capture Voldemort once and for all. Harry doubted that baby Voldemort would be able to do anything dangerous. Cedric Diggory. The third and final name was called out, and Harry's eyes blinked open. This wasn't what had happened before. This wasn't what was supposed to happen at all. He waited, thinking that maybe a fourth name would come out of the cup, but it never did. Harry was out of the tournament, and what bothered him was that he didn't understand why. Chapter 52. Message. "It doesn't make sense," Harry said. He was pacing back and forth in Dumbledore's office, agitated in the wake of learning that he was not going to be one of the Triwizard champions. There had been a time when this would have delighted him. But now that it had ruined his plan with Dumbledore, he was upset. "I'd think you'd be pleased," Dumbledore said mildly. "After all, you foresaw your death and now it won't happen." "That way," Harry said, scowling. "It ruins our plans, though." "No plan survives first contact with an enemy, or so I have heard the Muggles like to say." Dumbledore was remarkably composed for someone who had just learned that Voldemort was changing his plans in unpredictable ways. It occurred to Harry suddenly that Dumbledore was calm because he'd never assumed he could predict Voldemort in the first place. He hadn't had the benefit of advanced knowledge for much of his life, and so had never come to depend on it. Harry, though, felt as though his entire world had upended. He'd assumed that Voldemort would continue to hold the ceremony, only not in the graveyard since he already had the bone he needed. Now he felt helpless because there was no way to predict when Voldemort was going to come for him. At least he didn't have to worry about portkeys. The Hogwarts wards specifically prohibited them, just as they did apparition on the Hogwarts grounds. It was only the special nature of the task that had caused Dumbledore to allow an exception for the Champions' Cup. "He may have decided that he doesn't want me dead, that any champion will do for his resurrection." Dumbledore shook his head. "The spell you described to me is very old and dark magic. He'd need someone who has actually opposed him in the past. Unfortunately, after the last war that could number in the hundreds of wizards and witches, we are attempting to get the word out, but there is no way to protect them all." "You think he's going to try it without me at all?" "Possibly," Dumbledore said, "but be prepared just in the case that I am wrong." "I'm always prepared," Harry said. He'd had years of terror that had proved to him that not being prepared only led to pain and death. Dumbledore's lips quirked. "Did I not know better? I'd have thought Moody to be your father." Harry smirked. He really did get along with Moody, even if the Occlumency lessons were getting more and more painful as he was actually learning to resist having his mind invaded. Constant vigilance, Harry said. I think I'll change the Potter family motto to that. Dumbledore's eyes were twinkling as he reached out for a lemon candy. If Harry wanted to kill Dumbledore, poisoning the candy would be one of the first things he would try. It was a little arrogant of the man to be so predictable. He hesitated. Do the Potters even have a family motto? Dumbledore said, "It was inscribed on your parents' tombs. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." Harry froze. That seemed a little too apt to be coincidence. Had some Potter seer seen what was going to happen and sent this as a message to him? Or had his mother been inspired by it when she'd placed her protections on him? "I think I'll keep it as it is," Harry said finally. "What's going on with you?" Malfoy asked. For once he didn't have Crabbe or Goyle with him. It was unusual for him to be without his bodyguards. They normally followed him everywhere. "I don't know what you mean." Malfoy scowled. "You looked as though you expected to be picked for the tournament, even though you are clearly underage." Harry shrugged. "That's usually what my luck is like. Something is dangerous, I tend to be pulled into it." He wasn't sure why Malfoy was bringing this up. Malfoy's policy for years had been to keep his distance, ever since Harry had practiced the diffindo in their room. Why change now? As a Slytherin, it was possible that he was working both sides, the same way as some of Harry's contacts in Slytherin. Was he being prompted to do this by his father, or was he doing this on his own? "There's a rumor going around from some of the upper years," Malfoy said. "I don't know whether it is true or not." "What rumor?" Harry asked. Involuntarily, he looked around. They were in a deserted hallway, the exact kind of place that would be perfect for an attack. "Some people's parents told them that anyone who put your name in the cup wouldn't live out the school year," Malfoy said, "and their families wouldn't either." Harry stared at Malfoy. This was valuable information, not the sort of thing Malfoy would normally choose to share. "Why are you telling me this?" Malfoy leaned against the wall. "I just have to wonder why the Dark Lord cares whether you enter a school contest that you couldn't be a part of by the rules anyway." Harry knew why. Whether Voldemort had come back with him or simply glimpsed what was going to happen, the results were the same. He didn't want Harry to reset and have an opportunity to reverse whatever he did. The best option for him, of course, was to simply make sure that whatever he did wasn't obvious, at least until he had Harry in custody. Harry knew what he'd do if the situation was reversed. If he was a psychopathic villain with a time-traveling opponent, he'd capture him, have his tongue and hands cut off so that he wouldn't be able to use magic, and then he'd have him petrified. He'd probably transfigure the body and hide it somewhere. It was a brutal and cruel plan, but Harry suspected that it'd work. His fear was that Voldemort had thought of something similar and was simply waiting for an opportunity to make it happen. That way, even if he was revived, he wouldn't be a threat. And if the amputations were done with curses, there would be no way to reverse them. Malfoy was staring at him as though he was actually going to answer the question honestly. "Dark Lords are crazy," Harry said finally. "Next thing you know, he'll be fixing Quidditch matches." Of course, that was probably the one thing he wouldn't do. Wizards were almost as crazy for Quidditch as Muggles were for soccer, and getting involved in cheating at Quidditch might lead to an insurrection. Harry had a momentary thought about framing him, but quickly dismissed it. If he was caught, his own death would likely be painful. The last thing he needed was more dying. Sitting in the stands while the Triwizard tournament was going on was eerily strange. Harry had warned Dumbledore about the chains that had snapped when his dragon had attacked him, and when they'd been checked, they'd been found to be substandard. Dumbledore had also taken steps not to be in the stands, just in case another disaster happened and he was caught up in the panicked crowd. Harry had shown him a pensieve of the memory, and he'd agreed to heightened safety standards. Harry was sitting with Hermione and Neville. The first time he'd been on the Quidditch pitch facing a dragon, he hadn't noticed much about the audience. Now he noticed that for once, the audience wasn't segregated by house. Adults and children were sitting together, and there was no rhyme or reason to where anyone sat. Harry, of course, had sat as close to the exit as possible. He'd been trampled to death before, and he hadn't enjoyed the experience at all. Hermione was sitting close enough to him that he could feel the warmth of her arm. It annoyed him that he was as aware of this as he was. He'd promised himself that he'd have nothing to do with either Hermione or Fleur, and that should have been that. The crowd gasped as Krum hit the dragon with the conjunctivitis curse, and he began staggering back. Dumbledore had taken steps to magically protect the eggs after seeing Harry's vision, and now, as the dragon stepped on them, they were visibly unharmed. Harry felt a little uncomfortable with all the strangers in the crowd. Security was a little different in the wizarding world because every wizard carried a weapon. It was a wonder that assassinations didn't happen more often, especially given wizards' ability to apparate away. "This hardly seems safe," Harry said. "I'm sure that they've taken care of everyone's safety," Hermione said. "The dragon can't get past the shields." Harry had seen how well they'd taken care of safety. Even with his suggestions for how to improve safety, this seemed imprudent. He couldn't help but look at the chains that held the dragon. Dumbledore had assured him that the chains had been checked this time, and they were good. Still, he didn't like the way the dragon was straining at the chains as Krum approached. The dragon was lashing out blindly, trampling back and forth as Krum ran for the egg. Krum was moving well, keeping an eye on the dragon and staying well out of its way as it roared out its rage and pain. In the original timeline, he'd had marks off for destroying the eggs, but he'd made it out just fine. Trying to relax, Harry reassured himself that everything would be fine. After all, Krum had made his way through this before without any problems. There was no reason for anything to change now. Still, Harry couldn't help but have an uneasy feeling deep in his gut. Too many things had changed this time around, and this was making him feel distinctly uneasy. After all, there had been concerns the first time that Voldemort would attack the tournament. He probably hadn't the first time around, because the whole point was to lure Harry in so that he could kill him and use him to create a body. Now he didn't have that incentive, and given that the Ministry was using this as a way to shore up their popularity, it was an obvious target. The realization made Harry distinctly uncomfortable. He wasn't sure if wizards had magical versions of bombs, but a bomb in the stands would send shockwaves throughout wizarding society. Harry looked around and realized that there wouldn't be any way to detect a magical bomb in the middle of the crowd. He focused instead on the action in front of him. Krum was having to duck and weave as the dragon lashed out blindly. It was already starting to recover, and it could smell him, so Krum was going to have to move quickly to get the egg if he was going to get out. Krum lunged forward, and he grabbed the egg, lifting it in triumph. Leaning forward, Harry found himself cursing under his breath. It was when you thought you'd won that things were the most dangerous. Krum needed to be particularly careful now that he had the egg, because the dragon believed the egg was hers. The dragon would become even more aggressive and dangerous in this moment. Krum ducked around the dragon and began to run. Harry held his breath, then sighed in relief as Krum passed the outer range of what the dragon could reach while enchained. Harry was probably the only one in the audience watching the chains instead of the dragon, and so he was the only one who saw a spark of light. A section of the chains vanished, and a moment later the dragon was free. Krum didn't realize it at first. He was running, egg held overhead to the appreciation of the crowd. His first clue was when the cheers of the crowd turned into screams. The dragon breathed fire on him from behind. Krum turned to face the dragon, the expression on his face showing that he knew he was in trouble. He lifted his wand to defend himself, but it was going to be useless because dragons were largely spell-resistant. "Dodge!" Harry found himself yelling, but his voice was drowned out by the voices of hundreds of others screaming out in terror or apprehension. Humans didn't have 1/100th of the mass that a dragon did, which meant they could duck and change directions much more easily. Krum had extensive Quidditch experience, so he should be able to keep out of the dragon's way long enough for the dragon handlers to reach her, unless she trapped him against a wall. He'd cast a flame-freezing spell beforehand, and so he was unharmed as the fire washed over him. But the fire obstructed his view of what was happening until it was too late. The dragon handlers were running forward, trying to stop what everyone could see was about to happen, but it was too little and too late. Blood splattered against the shields, although thankfully none of it penetrated. The crowd began screaming, and Harry felt Hermione grab his arm. Was this the first time she'd seen someone die? Harry winced as he saw that the dragon was actually eating Crumb, even as the dragon handlers were trying to drag it off. He hugged Hermione as she turned her face into his chest, and he wondered why this was happening. The chains were sabotaged, Moody said. It was clearly meant to happen at the worst possible time for the champion. I'm surprised that Mr. Potter didn't foresee this with his visions, Snape said. The look he was giving Harry was unfriendly. He'd been the one person who hadn't seemed to believe Harry when he'd claimed to be a prophet. Harry wasn't sure how much the man had guessed, but he didn't see how he could have possibly seen the truth. I didn't see it, Harry said. This isn't what was supposed to happen. They were in Dumbledore's office. The second and third trials had been postponed because of questions about what had happened. Auras were investigating. Moody, Dumbledore, Sirius and Snape all looked grave and concerned. This might be a message to Karkaroff, Sirius said. He's a former Death Eater, and the message might be that he's not as safe as he thought he was. Moody shook his head. I think this is an effort to discredit the Ministry, a high-profile, low-risk attack. Scrimgeour had to be apoplectic, Harry thought. He'd put a lot of political capital into the success of the tournament, and this was going to tarnish everything he had done. Does it matter why he's doing it? Harry asked. The question is whether he's going to keep on doing it. Are Fleur and Cedric going to be safe if they continue with the contest? We could cancel the tournament, Sirius said. Dumbledore shook his head. The consequences for the surviving champions would be too grave. Is there any way to break the contract? Harry asked. In his experience, magic wasn't absolute. There were always workarounds. Dumbledore shook his head. The Goblet of Fire is 1,000 years old, and the magic that created it is beyond anything we can use today. To break the power of the cup would require someone more powerful than its creator, and I can tell you that I am not up to the task. If Dumbledore couldn't do it, then no one could. Change the tasks to something not dangerous, Sirius suggested. That might actually work, Dumbledore said, if the Ministry wasn't determined to go on with the contest. I've already spoken to Scrimgeour, and he's determined to push forward. The adults in the room scowled at that, clearly uncomfortable with Scrimgeour's decision. He's going to get those kids killed, Moody said. There will be a strong aura presence from now on, Dumbledore said, checking for every sign of an attack. It may be that Voldemort won't attack like this again. The question is whether you'll even be able to get the champions to compete, Harry said. The penalty for breaking the concrete may be less important than dying. Harry wondered what kind of courage it would take to step out onto the field after you knew that someone else had already died. He doubted that many of his classmates would have that kind of courage. Has anyone thought that this might be a distraction? Sirius asked. Keep us focused on this while something else is going on that we don't know about? Snape glanced at Harry. There's some indication that he's involved in something. He has been moving Death Eaters away from their normal haunts. He's keeping his own counsel about his plans. If Snape knew where Voldemort was, Harry wondered why he didn't simply kill him. As a baby, Voldemort could hardly defend himself. He had to be working from the background through Death Eaters he trusted more than Snape. He'd been with Crouch during his resurrection after all. Someone who knew what they were doing could spread disinformation among the ranks, claiming to be Voldemort and leaving them open to more attacks. Harry stared at Snape speculatively. The man looked back at him with a look that wasn't friendly. Fortunately, Harry was good enough at Occlumency that he'd be able to detect an intrusion even if he didn't know how to stop it. Moody said he had about a month left before he'd be ready. 2 months had seemed like an extraordinarily long time, but Harry was proud of the progress he'd made. Harry was tired of always defending and leaving the advantage to Voldemort. He wanted to find a way to strike at him in a way that the man would remember. Chapter 53. Champions. The Durmstrang students left overnight. It shouldn't have surprised anyone. With their champion dead, there was no longer any reason to stay. If the message had been to Karkaroff, it had been received. He was now retreating back to the secrecy of Durmstrang, hopefully beyond Voldemort's influence. The message to the rest of Wizarding Britain was less clear. The Ministry had decided to declare the failure of the chains as a result of mismanagement rather than sabotage. It had apparently been decided that it was less damaging to look incompetent than unable to contain yet another attack. In the end, the wizarding papers still screamed, and from what Sirius told him, the average wizard on the street was unhappy with the incident. From that perspective, the sabotage was very effective. It made Scrimgeour look weak, which was presumably at least part of the plan. Harry had thought that Cedric and Fleur might refuse to continue with the contest, despite the penalties called for by the magical contract. However, 3 days later they were on the field again, facing their own dragons. Fleur was first. She looked beautiful but was pale. Despite this, she looked relatively composed, and Harry found himself admiring her courage. She was facing death without any reassurance that she'd be able to reset if things didn't go her way, and she wasn't particularly powerful either. It had to take everything she had to stand tall in front of an audience of hundreds and not flee, but she did. Harry had found a seat on the other side of the stands, close enough to the exit that he'd be able to slip out and around onto the pitch if anything should happen. He wasn't going to let anyone else he cared for die, not if he could at all stop it. He had a plan to take care of Fleur's dragon. He had the vial of peanut butter in his pocket. He'd bought more darkness powder, and he'd even bought some of the Weasley's fireworks, all of which he was hiding under his robes. As the dragon rose onto its haunches, Harry tensed up, ready to leap down the steps and run out onto the field. Fleur, though, began to dance. It was hypnotic, and Harry found himself starting to relax almost in spite of himself. It wasn't anything like the dancing they'd done at the Yule Ball. This was slow and sensuous, and Harry could see that every male in the audience was transfixed. The crowd was utterly silent. After the disaster that had happened only 3 days before, it wasn't surprising, but her dance made sure of it. The dragon seemed almost as transfixed as everyone else. It shouldn't have been, as it was female, but Fleur was moving her wand as she danced. That might have had something to do with it. It took Harry a moment to realize that Fleur was moving forward slowly as she danced, moving side by side but incrementally forward with each pass, closer and closer to the dragon with each step. Harry found himself barely able to breathe as she moved into the dragon's range. Any misstep now would end in disaster. The crowd held its collective breath, but the dragon simply sat and watched her with the intensity of a cat watching its prey. Fleur spun, and Harry wondered how she was going to get the egg, but she made it part of her dance. This should have been enough to pull the dragon out of its trance, but it didn't. She didn't make Crumb's mistake either. She continued dancing even after she was out of the dragon's range. She continued until she was at the very edge of the field when she stepped into the champion's tent. There was a long moment of silence after she vanished from view, and then the crowd roared with approval. It wasn't at all the performance anyone had expected, but it had been performed expertly. Cedric was going to have a difficult time beating that performance. Even though Dumbledore had now replaced Karkaroff on the judges' panel, Fleur's performance had been flawless. There was a delay as the judges conferred, and a moment later they raised their signs indicating her score. She had received full marks. Harry saw her standing flushed with victory. She was sweating, but on her it looked beautiful, and she was swarmed with well-wishers. Part of him wanted to go over to her, congratulate her on her performance. Unfortunately, in this reality, she didn't know him. Harry suspected that seeing her indifference to him would be more painful than he'd realized, and it was better to stay away. That had been his plan all alone anyway. It was 20 minutes before the crowd had calmed again enough for Cedric to have his turn. He hadn't participated the last time, and so Harry had no idea what to expect from him. Cedric stood, and even though Fleur had survived, it still took courage to stand before the dragon. People thought Hufflepuffs were weak and had nothing to offer, but the goblet had chosen Cedric over everyone who had applied in every other house. He stood for a moment and then began pointing his wand downward at rocks on the field. He waved his wand and spoke words that Harry couldn't hear over the murmuring of the crowd. A moment later the rock shifted and changed, becoming a full-sized wolf. Cedric didn't stop there. He changed another rock and another. By the time he seemed to be satisfied, he had changed 6 rocks into wolves. He sent the wolves racing forward to attack the dragon. The dragon breathed fire, but the wolves were quick and dodged out of the way. They quickly surrounded the dragon, those in the back attacking, while those in the front stayed out of the reach of the dragon's teeth and claws. Cedric, in the meantime, walked as close to the wall as he could. He did his best to be quiet and unobtrusive. The dragon didn't seem to notice him. It was occupied with the irritating pests that had surrounded it. It managed to turn and grab one of the wolves, which yelped as it was thrown against a wall. It fell and lay still, unmoving as the other 4 continued to attack the dragon. Cedric was almost within the range of what the dragon could reach at the limit of its chains. Harry didn't know Cedric particularly well, but he wasn't about to let him die either. He wasn't sure he'd be able to do much from this distance, though. He could only hope that the dragon handlers were better prepared than they had been when Harry's own dragon had gotten loose. Dumbledore had replaced some of the crew based on the memory Harry had shared. He hadn't told anyone why, but Harry hoped that this group was at least a little more competent than the last group had been. Cedric made a subtle gesture with his wand, and the wolves began to attack more intensely. Cedric stepped into the dragon's range, and he began to casually make his way toward the eggs. The dragon didn't seem to notice him at first. It was occupied with the wolves. As Cedric grabbed the golden egg, however, it stiffened and turned toward him. Fire blasted over him and the eggs, but he'd cast a flame-freezing charm. Having heard of what had happened to Crumb, Cedric didn't stop moving, however. He used the cover provided by the flames to start running, and by the time the dragon had finished, he was halfway outside of her range. She lunged forward, and Cedric dodged. A transfigured wolf leapt in front of him, and the dragon's teeth bit down on it instead. The dragon spit it out, trying to get to Cedric before he could get outside the range of the chain, but it was too late. He didn't stop running until he reached the champion's tent, but the crowd was already roaring. Whatever his score was, he was a champion in the eyes of the school. There were flashes of light from the cameras, and Harry knew that Cedric was going to make the front of the papers. Fleur and Cedric were both champions, as far as Harry was concerned. Hermione shifted in her seat beside him. She'd been uncharacteristically quiet since the disaster 3 days ago. According to Neville, she'd been having nightmares about Crumb's death. Harry wasn't certain if Crumb had already been making advances toward her in this timeline or not. He suspected that he had. That being the case, seeing someone she'd started to get to know had to have been a shock to Hermione's system. Harry knew from experience just how difficult it was to lose someone you cared about, but he wasn't sure how to comfort her. He had no real experience at that at all. She didn't seem to want to talk about it, which was something Harry could understand, and so he didn't press her on the issue. He suspected that she didn't even know that she'd been talking to Crumb. In this timeline, he had no reason to know about it. It was easier to say nothing and see how things played out, although he was worried that this might not be the best decision. Not everyone had his experience with trauma, and not everyone could handle it as well as he had. "We ought to go," Harry said to her quietly. She simply sat without speaking for a moment. She looked as though she was lost in thought. Finally, she looked up at him and took his arm. "I was afraid it was going to happen again," she said. Harry nodded. "I think everyone was." There was a palpable sense of relief in the crowd. People were chatting excitedly, and Harry suspected that Cedric was going to be treated like a king this evening, no matter what his score. The judges were conferring, and a short while later they came up with their score. It wasn't as good as Fleur's, but it was still high. The crowd cheered for Cedric nonetheless. Hermione clutched Harry's arm as they made their way out of the stands and onto the Hogwarts grounds. The announcement of the Yule Ball was taken with the same excitement that Harry had remembered, although the missing Durmstrang students meant that some of the couples Harry had remembered had to reorganize themselves. As girls who had gone out with Durmstrang students were asked out for dates, this meant that the girls who would have been asked out had to find other partners, which resulted in a strange kind of ripple effect that Harry had not expected. Harry had expected to be able to skip the ball. After all, he was no longer one of the champions and wasn't actually required to attend. He thought it might be a little painful to watch Fleur and Hermione dancing with other people, and his first impulse was to avoid the event altogether. However, he hadn't reckoned with Hermione. "I can teach you to dance," she said. "I'm not going," Harry said, "and I know how to dance." "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked. "It doesn't exactly seem like the kind of thing you'd be interested in." Harry shrugged. "I learn things here and there." "Your aunt and uncle don't seem like the kind who'd shell out for lessons," Hermione said. Harry hadn't told her much about his family life at home. It wasn't a subject he particularly cared to dwell on, but he'd told her a little, and Neville a little more, and they'd talked. Hermione had read between the lines and had made some fairly astute guesses about what his aunt and uncle had been like. If it wasn't for Harry's advantages, she'd be the smartest in their year. It frustrated her that he seemed never to study. He couldn't exactly tell her about her satisfaction when he finally seemed to be lagging behind on those occasions when he was experiencing a year for the first time. "I'm good at everything," Harry said, and then grinned at her. He was happier with her irritated with him than quiet and mopey the way she'd been for the last several days. "Prove it," she said. "What, here?" "Wherever you like," she said. "In the middle of the Great Hall if you want." Harry hesitated. He was entering dangerous ground here, and he knew it. Despite that, he found himself wanting to put a smile on her face. The crinkle around her eyes that had never gone away since Crumb died was bothering him more than he wanted to think about. "I've got a better place," he said. "I'll show you after dinner." It was a rare opportunity that Harry got to show someone a wonder of magic, not once but twice. This time he was going to do it right, and with any luck he was going to put a smile on her face. He found himself unusually excited as the day wore on. He had ruined the reveal of the room the last time with his clumsy date request. This time he had no intention of doing so. After dinner, Harry found Hermione, and he led her up several sets of stairs to the 7th floor. "It's across from the painting of Barnabas the Barmy," Harry said, gesturing. "Just watch." He walked back and forth 3 times, concentrating on what he wanted. It took him a moment, but the door appeared. He took her hand, and they stepped into the great hall as Harry had remembered it. The walls were covered in silvery, sparkling frost, with garlands of mistletoe and ivy crossing the starry sky on the ceiling by the hundreds. There were 100 lantern-lit tables, each with seats for 12 people. The main difference from his memory was that they were alone. There were no other dancers. It was a little eerie, now that Harry was actually in the room. "What?" Hermione asked, looking astounded. "This room can be anything you want it to be," Harry said. He gestured. "You wanted me to prove that I could dance." As she stepped through the portal, it vanished behind her. Harry reached into his robes and pulled out a music box. "The room doesn't do living things, so I had to bring my own music," Harry said. "I borrowed this from the twins." Hermione looked suddenly uneasy. "Are you sure you shouldn't have gotten it from someone else?" Harry shrugged. "I've mostly broken the twins out of the habit of pranking me. If they do anything too terrible, I'll make them regret it." Hermione conspicuously stepped away as Harry set the box on a table. He opened the box, ready to step away if exploding dye or some other monstrosity came out of the box. Happily, there was nothing but a ballerina inside. He began to crank the box with a little lever on the side. Apparently, they'd just modified a Muggle music box, which Harry suspected was illegal. As he stepped away from the box, music began to play. For a moment, he was afraid that the Weasleys would have put some sexual music as a way of teasing him. He hadn't told them what it was for specifically because he didn't want them to tease either him or Hermione. Fortunately, he recognized the tune. It was wizarding music that had played during the first ball by the Weird Sisters. He offered his hand to Hermione. Even though it had been several months in his own personal timeline, Harry discovered that he hadn't forgotten how to dance. His memories of Fleur were too intense for that. So, when he took Hermione's hand in his and began to move around the room, he enjoyed the look of astonishment on her face. Although he was a little uncertain at first, the steps came back to him and became more natural the longer he did it. It seemed more natural to dance with Hermione as well. Maybe it was the fact that he didn't have hundreds of people staring at him, or maybe it was the fact that he wasn't overwhelmed by Fleur's natural charisma. It was relaxing, and maybe even a little fun, which was something Harry hadn't gotten to experience much of during his life. He grinned at her as the song ended. "See, I told you I was good at everything." "Where did you learn how to dance?" she asked. Harry shrugged. "I picked it up here and there." "Why?" Hermione asked. "You don't learn anything that won't make you a better fighter." Harry stared at her. "Are you calling me lazy?" "Yes," she said. "If it's about fighting or something you think you can use, you are one of the hardest working people I've ever seen. If it's something you don't think you can use, you're as lazy as Ron Weasley." "Hey," Harry said, a little hurt, "don't compare me to him." The truth was, he sometimes admired what he'd heard of Ron's legendary sloth. The boy never seemed to crack open a book, and he seemed to know how to enjoy life in a way that Harry couldn't remember ever having done. It would have been nice to have been that free of worry, that free of thought. Harry was often so worried about the future that he didn't really get to live in the moment. "Pay attention in history of magic or astronomy, and I might change my mind," Hermione said. Harry grimaced. "I'm not sure I can stand another goblin rebellion or another look at the moons of Jupiter." It was worse than she knew. History of magic was boring the first time through. The second time was excruciatingly boring. The same was true of astronomy. Hermione hesitated. "Go with me to the ball." "What?" Harry asked, astonished. "I don't have anyone to take me, and I really want to go." Harry felt himself speechless for the first time he could remember. He'd tried a similar tactic when he'd asked her to the ball, and she'd rejected him. Now she was here saying the same thing, and he couldn't even comment on the hypocrisy of it because she didn't remember the first time. "I was planning on going home over the break," he said. "You won't have any trouble finding someone to the dance. Trust me, I've seen how some of the boys look at you." "You don't even like your family," she said. "Not really. You're just going home to avoid the ball. Why?" She knew him well enough to see right through him, on this issue at least. Harry realized that he should have come up with a better excuse. "Anyone I dance with will be in danger," Harry said, "so it's best for everyone if I just stay away." "I've already got a target on my back 3 times over," Hermione said. "I'm your best friend. I'm a Muggle born, and I beat every pure blood and half-blood in the school except for you." Harry stared at her. He'd always thought she humoured his paranoia as much as anything. "Since Victor, I've started thinking a lot about the times you've been right," Hermione said. "You were right about the Dementor attack, about the troll, about most of it, really." "While I'm the first to admit that I'm always right," Harry said, "why bring this up now?" "If you're right about all of it, what happens if you leave school and I'm still here?" she asked. "Wouldn't that be the perfect opportunity to kill one witch with 2 stones? As a manipulation, it was masterful, playing on his paranoia and his sense of loyalty. The truth was that she was probably in more danger at home than at school, with him or without him. The problem was that Harry didn't understand what kind of game Voldemort was playing, and there might be a grain of truth to what she was saying. "All right," he said reluctantly, "I'll go with you." He had a feeling he was going to regret this,